The last 10 years have been a tumultuous period for Western democracies, domestically and internationally. We face a new decade, a dangerous decade in which the challenges to our security and to our way of life may be ever more acute. The response of Western nations and their leaders will need to be firm, calm, and concerted. Neither weakness nor anger will serve us. Few international problems today lend themselves to simple solutions. One reason is that few such problems can any longer be treated in isolation. Increasingly, they interact. Thanks to a still accelerating technological revolution, we become daily more aware that the earth and its resources are finite and in most respects shrinking. Today, it is painfully obvious that no man and no nation is an island. The immediate threat from Russia is not only to security in Europe, but also both directly and by proxy, the developing world. Meanwhile, they expand their armed forces on land, sea, and air. Their men, their ships, and their aircraft appear ever more regularly in parts of the world where they have never been seen before. All of this has coincided with a prolonged period of uneasiness in the dark spaces of the world. The precarious balance of the world economy could at any time be shaken by political upfields in one or more countries over which the rest of us might have very little influence. While social, political, and armed extremist movements march ever forward, threatening the security of every nation. We must not regard these problems as insoluble. The West has immense material and moral assets. To those assets must be added the clarity to understand where our strength should be used, the will and confidence to use them with precision, to engage, to act, and to see things through. As Chris introduced, my name is Anthony Aguilar. I'm currently serving in 1st Battalion, 3rd Special Forces Group. Based on the discussion that we heard this morning from Paul, I love being a Green Beret, and it's my commitment to establish a learning organization that can understand the complex world and the threats that we are going to face today and tomorrow. The statement that I just read could have been pulled out of any headline from today's news. All of the elements are things that we're talking about today on the world stage. But that statement actually came from 1979, verbatim from the words of Margaret Thatcher to the World Political Press Institute in New York City. A lot of the things that she outlined are things, the exact threats that we are facing today in spaces of the world where we as an organization in special operations are going to be expected to act, to engage, and to understand. So with that, I've spent the last decade of research looking at social mobilization, political mobilization, and why extremist groups act the way they do. If I'm at home living with my family and I have a comfortable life, I make decent money, I have security, what compels me to join an organization or a movement that may put my life at risk? What compels me to take action and leave behind my way of life? These are the questions and these are the challenges that enemies across the world currently enact and face, and therefore put us in areas that we must engage. So the objective today is to understand, to create collective understanding, and how might unified action partners. Now this is a term that I've used throughout a lot of my writing, but it is not a term that I made up. This is out of ADRP 3-0 in our joint publication 1. Unified action partners include everyone in this room, in uniform, outside of uniform, those that contribute to the collective understanding of the environment, from the Department of State to the CIA to the President. We are all unified action partners. How do we better understand the complexities of conflict? What is our role and where do we engage in this world stage? So as practitioners, as those of us that wear uniforms, as those of us that work in the unified government approach throughout the world, we have to think more deeply about these arrangements. When we look in why ISIS comes to be, why Boko Haram comes to be, where these organizations come from. They don't spring up overnight in these places in the world. We have to think more deeply about these arrangements. We have to understand these alliances when extremist organizations come together and break apart and why they choose to do so. The ideologies, the relationships that emerge, and not only during the conflict we're in, but before the conflict occurs and while we are engaging in the actual scenario. So I've taken the opportunity to pull up what some of our senior leaders have said about this. How do we become a learning organization? What's important as we look at the human dimension of conflict? General Charles Cleveland, our commander, states that it is essential that we learn, anticipate, and evolve to defeat an adaptive enemy and the complex threats of the 21st century. Learn. It's not intuitive to look at a situation and simply understand what we must do. Learning is a difficult task. Just whether we come out of the basic course or in our advanced courses, when we learn the skills of a soldier, it takes time and energy. It takes commitment. As General Martin Dempsey stated, it starts with the intellectual bandwidth more than anything else. We have to shift our intellectual bandwidth and start to understand the how and the why. It's not just about resources or equipping or basing, it's about thinking. We are the best equipped, most well-trained force in the world. We must also be the best thinkers to identify the threats that come before us before they happen so we can engage broadly and deeply. So as we look at these, what's the origins of insurgency? And I focused mainly on intrastate conflict and insurgency because, as most scholars have researched, 80% of the world conflict since 1970 has involved an aspect of insurgency throughout the world, in every corner, in every region, in every culture. So in one of these, we look at these stories of peoplehood. We all have stories. We all have a past. We all have an understanding of where we came from. Whether you grew up on the West Coast or in Middle America or an immigrant family that made something of yourself in this country, we all have a story. Well, the rest of the world and the people that we face, whether it's in combat or through engagement, have a story as well. These stories are important because these stories are what make people who they are. They're what get people out of bed in the morning to raise a family, to do what they think is right. And these things have an impact on how they fight, how they mobilize, and what they determine between right and wrong. So human beings in society create collectively. They come together to create organizations, whether it's a baseball team, a PTA organization at a school, a police organization, a fire department, all the way from civil society, all the way up to the highest levels of government. It's created by human beings. These things are created both through conflict and cooperation, to where, hey, me and you, we got a great idea, let's come together and make this happen. Or you and I, we don't like them, so let's make something to undermine them. The simplicity of these arrangements is what comes to be in the conflicts that we see today. Some of these elements are patterned. Some of them we can look at ethnicity, race, culture, and make predictions. Some of them are not. In some cases, we see where completely ideological different organizations actually come together to achieve an objective, which in and of itself is counterintuitive. So some of the things that I've been researching over the last few years to understand how these things take root: ethnicity, something that we can all understand. Ethno-nationalism, something that we see in ISIS. It's not just a matter of creating an environment of who they are, but creating an environment with a specified geographical area and a national movement. Religion, something we see all over the world in many aspects and that you experience every day in your own life. Socio-political orders. In some countries of the world throughout Southeast Asia where caste systems still exist. In our own culture where you go to school or how much money you have or what kind of car you drive. Those are all social-political implications that have an effect in everyday life. And then the geographic, where I live, where I'm from, what my flag is. So all of these create what I've determined to be somewhat of causal paths to look at how these conflicts might happen in the future. If we can look at right now in a region and take a certain understanding of an environment and see how that might unfold. It gives us understanding as to how we can act. It gives us understanding as to where we can place our energy and our focus. So these political and social and economic inequalities following group lines generate grievances and perceptions that motivate conflict and create dynamic and contentious environments. The point of outlining some of these elements here in the beginning of this theory is to show that in scholarship, where cutting-edge scholars throughout the world have looked into conflict, have looked into understanding what we do in uniform. So it led me to ask, This view that we have of the world from this Western point of view that, in particularly the United States, that if you live in a certain state, that's your geographical boundary. When you cross that boundary and go into another state, you're in someone else's territory. Does this understanding of how we think of things in the West, does that carry through to everybody's understanding throughout the world? I posit that it does not, because when you consider organizations such as ISIS and their growing expanse, there is no consideration for the current political boundaries of a country. It is based on the ethno-nationalistic movement to create something new that we may not agree with. So as we look at these organizations, as they increase and as they grow and as they become more violent, we have to understand why they're doing it and what they want to achieve. Not just what the news says, or not just what they say, they have their own narrative, but we understand what they're going to do. So basically, my emphasis behind this in terms of how we plan and how we understand and how we look at things is through a scholarly approach. The control that I used for myself in looking at this was that we had to look at things that were that pertained to our profession, but also using military frameworks, using the planning frameworks that we use already, ASCOPE, DIME. If you're looking at the tactical level, your MET-TC. Using those frameworks, but adding to it scholarship to better understand. And if so, is it valuable? Does it do anything for us? So if any of you have ever heard of Fotini Kristia, she's from MIT. She spent 8 years in Afghanistan studying the Taliban, living with Pashtuns and Tajiks and with the Hekmatyar Taliban, understanding how they fight and why alliances break apart and come together. And understanding those questions that we see in Afghanistan right now, for those of you that have been there, some numerous times, why the environment seems to change so rapidly, why some things stay the same, and why some things that we try to do will never be. So here's an individual who is a civilian that teaches at an Ivy League school that has spent nearly a decade in a very contentious region of the world. There's something to value from that insight. And she says that when people come together in a conflict, whether it's an alliance or a faction, that first and foremost, they want to win the conflict they're in. If you're in a group and the group that's on the other side of the fence, you all come together in conflict, well, the goal is to win. We all understand that, but she goes further to say that it's not just about winning, it's about maximizing what we get in the end. So if I got a group of 10 guys and there's another group of 10 people here and we're going to come together to win the war, but I know that in the end the other 9 guys are going to take my piece of the pie, I might break away and go start my own group or join someone else because it may take me longer to win, but I'm going to get more in the end. That's a counterintuitive approach to how we normally see conflict and how things are going to unfold. And this brings in those human dynamics that people have decisions. People make choices based on how they live their life. The other, we'll look at wartime political orders, and this is Paul Stanlin out of the University of Chicago. And he states that these organizations will come together, they'll break apart further from fragmenting and segmenting, because it's all about relative power. So he describes these in terms of the insurgent, or those that are trying to inspire change, and the incumbent. That, if you look at a country where there's a sitting political member, that's the incumbent. And it's not necessarily just about overthrowing them or changing out the power mechanism. It may be about sharing power, to where if I'm an insurgent and I know that I never have the resources and the means to overthrow the government that I'm in contention with, maybe I can get them to a point to where we can share power. If any of you have read about the southern Philippines and southern Mindanao in Southeast Asia, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front has originally brought the government of the Philippines to accords to have certain offerings in southern Mindanao, something they've been fighting about for the last 50 years. So these things matter, these things pertain. The U.S. government spends billions of dollars to influence these outcomes. Next, I looked at the movements, power distribution by Peter Krause, another MIT scholar. And he says that these alliances that are pursued in solidarity are not always the best option for a movement. We kind of have this view from an American point of view that we came together to overthrow the brains of tyranny, to establish this new country, and that's our perception. In some regions of the world, breaking apart into smaller groups so you have more power to spread is better. in some cases. Has anyone watched the news lately where there's some talk about ISIS sharing their brand with Boko Haram? And that's been on the news lately. Looking at this type of scholarly approach, it's not a coincidence. It's not the fact that ISIS is just trying to simply make their organization bigger. It's also about the spread of power. The more power they can have, whether it's through a fragmented scenario or through a unified scenario, the more powerful they become. These are dangerous things that we have to understand. And those that wear this uniform, that put our lives at risk, that go out there on the edge of battle, need to understand how these things unfold so we can better prepare ourselves for it, for our force, and for our abilities to actually engage. And he basically breaks things down into hegemonic, united, and fragmented. Essentially what this says, there's an organization out there that's fragmented. Their ability to come together to actually get something done is probably low on the scale of success. So, take this back to an arrangement of gangs in inner city California and some cities, which is where we did some of our research on these organizations. When these gangs have territorial beef and they don't get along and they can't come together, who owns what corner, they don't succeed. They're very fragmented. When you have an organization that comes together that's under one power, whether it controls the economy, the weapons, who sells what, you get something like the Medellin cartel. So you see these things throughout the world. These same applications apply in some of the people that we are engaging with right now in the world in a violent way. And then the last piece, I'll throw my own piece in there, unconventional warfare, how I applied it as a Special Forces soldier, as a Special Forces planner and operator, a unified action partner. How do we look at unconventional warfare? Because that's what we do. That's our bread and butter. So I looked at this through relative power, why people make a decision to actually go out and do something, why I join an extremist organization. So in looking at some of these, and these are just a few that I picked to showcase, we went into asking this through experimental action. And experimental action is doing nothing more than a course of action, red hat type of way, that we do in our MDMP, where we get the guys at the S2 to sit down and he gives us everything the enemy's going to do, and we come back with what we're going to do, and he war games it, and we do this scenario in our planning. Well, scholars do the same thing, and we can bring this into our military planning, and we did this through experimental action. So we took all these theories, and we just applied them into context. And this was in 2010, where colleagues and I that worked together brought this forward to look at, as the U.S. goes into a post-Iraq scenario, where we're still in Afghanistan, and we know that there are threats emerging throughout the world, what is the most dangerous threat that we might see? And this was simply hypothetical, pulling in theories of what the most dangerous or most likely was and pulling together and say, what might that look like? So we started from the beginning. We say, okay, let us consider religiously motivated, because we all know that religion runs deep. Religion motivates people to kill. Religion motivates people to live. Religion motivates people to do things that otherwise they wouldn't do. That's ethno-nationalistic, meaning that for their people they want a land. When you consider the aspects of Ireland or Scotland, they want a land to be in. And that it's non-border bounded, meaning they don't care about current political boundaries and what state has what. They want their own, and they're willing to fight for it. And this movement comes out of something where there's a void in power, whether it's in Central Africa or in Iraq or in Afghanistan. When there's a void of power, strongly motivated political groups have the ability to gain power very rapidly. And they're unified under this sense of nationalism in a place where nationalism doesn't necessarily abound. In the United States, nationalism is very strong, generally. In some countries where there's a bisection of religion, ethnic lines, that sense of nationalism isn't necessarily there. We see it every day in the U.S., but it's different in a lot of these other countries that where we're going to find ourselves fighting in. So then we broke it down a little bit further, and we said this organization's aim, they want to endure. So they're not necessarily going to come out and fight the war immediately. And if we look at this, we've been fighting some of these individuals, some of these organizations for the last 10 to 15 years. In the southern Philippines, we've been fighting them for the last 52 years. In South America, we've been fighting them for the last 48 years. None of these conflicts are new. So they not only want to endure, they want to maintain their ability. They want to exist. simply by existing, gives them power. If I'm alive tomorrow, I've won the day. And to win the prolonged conflict politically and socially. Notice I didn't say only through armed conflict, but politically and socially, because that's how movements endure after the violence is over. They want to have a geographical area they can call their own. Right now in the news, we see that as the Levant. In other regions, we see it as an autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao in Southeast Asia. We see it in areas where the FARC controlled areas of Central America. They want to have a narrative, who we are, where we came from. In the United States, we have a narrative. Every day when you go to a baseball game or a NASCAR race and they play the national anthem, there's a narrative of who we are. That strengthens these ties. And then that social identity, that I identify as what, to where you and I might not have anything else in common, but we both wear this uniform. We identify with something outside of anything else, and then it goes deeper than that. So we use these two premises in the beginning to look at how might these organizations come together. They do this, they do this. Okay, they have the ingredients to be powerful. I hope this doesn't happen because it's really bad. And then we looked at these alliances start to form transnationally around the world. This organization that's here that once was just a little thorn in our side that, we'll do something about it later, grows. They link up with another organization, and now we got to kind of pay attention. And then they start to link up even further, and we really got to pay attention because our allies are threatened. And sub-factions and factions start to emerge and break apart. Alliances start to form. Power distribution. And then pretty soon it results in a hegemonic movement. One movement overall that controls the narrative, controls who they are, controls what their goals are, and controls what they're going to do. And lastly, we said, okay, all these things happen, but what are they going to do? Okay, so they form this up and they come to be, but so what? Well, the group will start to test international and regional resolve. They'll start to do things to figure out, are you really committed to stopping me? How much can we get away with? And it'll become very violent very fast to test the parameters of what the international community will put up with. Bold claims start to come out of, after we get this, we're going to take all of it. We're going to attack you, America. We're going to attack you, Europe. We're going to dismantle NATO. Armed conflict ensues. Those that initially did not want to be in armed conflict are now drawn into it because they have no choice. And this is, again, this was back in 2010 that we looked at this, and it was a hypothetical scenario. So what did that start to look like for us? As we looked at this scenario and we said, how might that play out? As a uniform action partner, where I might have to put my life on the line or order those to put their lives on the line, what are we going to face? Well, this is the question that we asked in 2010. What will this threat look like? Well, it started to look a lot like this. So as we look at how scholarship can inform policy, how we as military and practitioners can inform policy for action, it is incumbent upon us to be the most adaptive thinkers in the room. Because when it's all said and done, not only do we put that plan into action, we go downrange and we put our lives at risk for our country, but also for the plans that we've laid. As we look at this scenario, these type of situations emerge throughout the world. It's not just in the Middle East. It's not just in the Central Asian states. It's all over the world. The ingredients for these things to occur is ever present. So when we talk about, under USASOC 2022, and we talk about engage in the human dynamic, well, that starts with understanding the human dynamic. That starts with understanding that not only what the enemy's going to do, but what can a potential ally might do so they don't become a potential enemy someday. And this is deep in history, social politics, things that are outside of our doctrine. When you sit down and you look at a plan, you say, okay, I'm going to write out this plan. I'm going to use A-scope. I'm going to use dime. I'm going to do my little A-scope dime crosswalk, and I'm going to throw in some MET-TC. I know I shouldn't cross that river because it's really deep. That's great. We need that. But we also need a little bit of this. Because it doesn't matter that river that you cross, whether you can cross it or not, and if the end, the political solution breaks down and we find ourselves where we are now.